Welcome back to The Outright Effect, a podcast in which unique perspectives challenge us to be better versions of ourselves. We're two ambitious women who talk about how we like to stretch our creativity and work on self-growth to become better people. I'm Shelly.
And I'm Tempsy. And today we have a special guest with us, a guest that you have heard on our podcast before. Her name is Carol Surban, and we wanted to bring her on. This is actually going to be the first of a two-part series. We're going to be discussing two types of really big life changes. And we wanted to bring Carol on because she's had some experience with these two types of changes and had some really great insights to share. You know, there's quite a few people right now who have or are actually contemplating a move to a new place that is completely different than what they're used to. And it's my understanding that it's mostly due to wanting more space while being maybe quarantined, or more so now that the pandemic has impacted them financially. So they're looking for a more affordable option. So Carol actually moved to another country a few years ago. And as you all know, I made a big move recently as well. So we thought it'd be really interesting to have a conversation about big changes in one's life and what to consider, whether it's moving to a new country or even leaving a 9-to-5 and starting a business. So welcome back, Carol.
Hi, thanks for having me, you guys. This is great.
So happy to have you back. Let's start by, why don't you tell us a little bit about your big move?
Yeah, so it's going to be 3 years. June 18th, it'll be 3 years.
Wow.
We moved from Hawaii in the United States to Manila in the Philippines. So a country move, culture move. My husband is Filipino and had an opportunity to come back and work on some family property that needed his attention because there was really nobody else that was willing to kind of pick up the challenge of it. And I was right in the middle of having just quit my 9-to-5 job and trying to figure out what I was going to do next, and just having this as an idea of this could be a place to kind of figure out what's next kind of space. So yeah, we kind of hooked into it shortly after I quit my job, like the idea of it. And then it just kind of started to grow, and we started to do some research. Is this even possible? What's good? What's not good? And then made the leap. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting too. And I definitely think that, not only I think people have a variety of different reasons for moving, right? Whether it be to be closer to family, maybe it's that dream job somebody just got offered. Maybe it's like moving to an area because housing or the cost of living is less expensive from wherever someone is currently living. But, I also think that reflection of the past year or so, some people are even moving because they're just like, I took a step back and looked at my life, and I feel like I really like to live here instead. And then so I feel like people did that too. And that I think is like just very interesting. And hearing especially a move to another country, like that's giant. I mean, I think there's like a lot of things involved with moving, but going to another country adds probably at least a few other elements into like how complex it could be.
Yeah. And I think you brought up an interesting point too, Shelly, because I think that was the ability to do something different was definitely in the calculus for me on this, because I knew we were moving to a place. We're moving from one of the most expensive places in the United States to live, Hawaii, right? Like it's not an easy thing to do, to live there without the support of family, because neither my husband nor I had family in Hawaii. And we're moving to a less expensive place. And that was definitely part of the calculus too, was like, okay, I could buy some time, to kind of try and figure out what it was I wanted to do next in my life. What didn't go into the calculus was that a year and a half in, there would be a pandemic. That was not part of my spreadsheet. So that was a bit of a surprise. But yeah, like it was kind of an idea of like, this could buy some time to help me figure out what I want to do next, what my husband wants to do next, that kind of thing. And also being in a place where like travel, like at the time, like, our goals were around kind of being able to do some more like family adventuring, travel. And we did that like in the first year we were here, we did some fun travel, but then the pandemic hit. And so that shifted, it shifted our focus for sure. Yeah.
Right. Now, there's obviously like a lot of logistical considerations considerations to consider when moving, period. But in a move of this magnitude, what additional considerations did you have to think about in terms of logistics, but family considerations?
Yeah, I mean, it was, my son at the time was 8. So he's almost 11 now, but we had an 8-year-old son. And so it was not just a decision that was like made unilaterally with me and my husband. We asked our son and brought him into the decision process, and he was excited because it's where his dad is from. And my husband was born and raised here. So it was an exciting proposition for him. So it was definitely getting everybody on board was an important piece of it. The other thing was really around, kind of being mindful of those sort of mental hurdles that they're not like when you move to a new place, there's all of these things that are obvious, right? Like the whole, it's a new country, different language, different systems, even kind of different values and different things like that. But the thing that sometimes you don't think about is your own sort of internal structures and how you do things and what you're feeling about things and how you're going to react to things. So that was a big part of like, okay, what do we need to think about? And it got me thinking about culture shock. And I went and did some research on, what are the stages of culture shock? There's like, and I learned a lot about that. There's like a honeymoon stage, and then there's like a regret, and then there's an acceptance. And it's almost kind of like a different version of like those stages of grief. And so it was getting like starting to do a little bit of recognition of like, okay, there's going to be sort of like mental and emotional things I need to consider about this besides just, what is our health insurance going to look like and where are we going to live and that kind of thing.
That's really cool. Something that I think is really neat that you mentioned is bringing your son into the conversation about moving and asking him how he felt about that. So, I mean, for example, I've never moved in my life except for 20 minutes away from the house I grew up in. But I'm pretty sure my parents, like, if they were planning to move somewhere, I don't feel like they would have asked me how I felt about it. I feel like they would have just been like, this is what we're doing. So I think that's really cool that you asked him. And that he was excited too and had that conversation. So that's neat.
Yeah. Well, and some of it goes back to some of my work in doing like leading teams and leadership work, like it's so much easier to lead a group of people if everybody's on board, right? Like, and it's just like from a family perspective, it's the same thing. Like it's so much easier to get your family engaged and moving towards something that you want if everybody has an opportunity to kind of share what they're thinking and you can make adjustments and that kind of thing. It just made it for an easier transition for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's funny because Carol, you and I had a discussion before I moved, and it was a discussion about something else, but we transitioned into the fact that I was moving, and you had not only mentioned culture shock, but you also mentioned reverse culture shock.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, reverse culture shock. And that was, so like, in some ways the move, the sort of the emotion, like emotional, mental, psychological impact of the move affected my husband more than it did my son and I, because and I learned about this when I was kind of researching what the impacts of doing something like this could be on a family, of reverse culture shock. And that's where you have somebody like, so he was born and raised in Manila. He lived here till he graduated from college, and then he moved to the States. And then he lived in the United States for like 25 years. And then he's coming back. And so reverse culture shock, it's where culture shock is where you're moving from one place to another, and you've got all these sort of either expectations about the place you just came from or preconceived notions about the place you're going to. And those are actively in play in your thinking, as opposed to kind of dealing with just like what's right in front of you, And so you've got these conflicting sort of expectations that are living inside of you that can create a lot of turmoil and sometimes anxiousness or pain, that kind of thing. And for my husband, he had not only that, moving from the States to the Philippines, but he had his expectations of what the Philippines used to be like 25 years ago, right? And so he had, oh, it's much more crowded. It's much more this, like his mind was comparing not only the Philippines of today from the Philippines of 25 years ago, but also from Hawaii, of the place we just left. And so in some ways he had, twice as many sort of expectations he was trying to manage and work through and be kind of level setting when we moved here and adjusted to it. And it took him, I think it took him longer because of that, just to kind of, I mean, we had consciousness of it, the concept of reverse culture shock, but it took him longer to kind of sort of find his ground, like get grounded in where we are and what we're doing. And some of his culture shock too was around expectations of family. Like, the family that had been here 25 years ago obviously changed. There's people that have either moved on, passed away, close-knit parts of the family weren't as close anymore. So it was even kind of familial culture shock in that, like, what he was expecting to kind of land us in didn't necessarily come to pass. Yeah.
As you're explaining that, I'm thinking of like a time warp situation, like to some degree, right? You're like thinking like, that used to be here. I used to go here. It looks different now. Like, that was my friend, like that's where we used to hang out or whatever. And that's not there anymore. Or like something's replaced it or something. So yeah, those are kind of like the images that I was picturing in my mind as you were explaining his experience with the situation, like being in a time warp. I haven't personally had that happen to me, but I could definitely see how someone has this, like, they put this like time capsule around this image that they spent so much time in, left for a long time, and then came back to a totally different image.
I was completely taken aback when you initially explained all of that to me, because I thought back to when my husband and I initially moved to Hawaii, 8 years ago now, and he went through the same thing. The Honolulu of yesteryear was not the same as the Honolulu that we moved back to. And, there was a little bit of a change in terms of the aloha spirit, in his opinion. But I mean, he did work through it, and we ended up staying there for 7 years, right? So I also realized that I kind of went through those stages as well, not just when I moved to Hawaii with him, but when we ended up moving back here to Las Vegas, of going through like honeymoon, regret, and so on, because it's just such a big change in your life that, you're so excited about it before you go. And then when you get there, it's just, it's different from what you imagined it to be, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and hearing you guys talk, one of the things that, and I don't think you and I've talked about this, Temsi, but like, there's a sense of grief that underlies these transitions. And it's a hard kind of thing to really even want to acknowledge in the moment, because there's that, like, we need to be excited about what we're doing, right? Like, sometimes it's a scary transition. And so you're trying to tap into excitement versus fear, right? And so in some ways, those kind of quieter thoughts and emotions that come up around grieving the loss of something, right? Whether it's returning to something that's no longer what it used to be, or leaving something that, even though you're excited to go where you're going, there's a loss there, right? And I think that's part of what can make those transitions more challenging too, is if you don't actually give yourself some space to acknowledge that there is grief and there is sadness and there is loss. And I think it's interesting because this past year with living with the pandemic, I think that's what I have seen a lot of people going through, honestly, is a sense of loss, for the last year, of different aspects of life, right? And when you make a big transition, that's true of that too. Like, you're, as much as you're excited and eager to move into new space, you have to give some things up to do that. And that's scary and also sad. And I think oftentimes we channel the scary into excitement for the new, but where do you channel the sad? Like, where does that go? And I think it's something I'm just realizing right now, that like that is it's helpful to have people in your life to be able to talk about those kinds of things and kind of process them. Because I think a lot of times we don't get a chance to do that, and it can bubble up in some interesting ways when you don't address it.
So I always find that if I anticipate or try to anticipate an emotional change or a change that drives a different type of emotion, I handle it better. And so do you feel like there are things that folks out there could do if they are planning a big change, a big move for whatever reason? How can they mentally prepare? Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, and this actually was some advice I was given by a friend and kind of mentor of mine. And, he said, it was when I was quitting my job. And he said, resist the urge to focus on, trying to get everything done, and make sure you're spending time with people. Have coffees, go to lunches, do the things that will connect you with people. And I really took his advice to heart. And so when I made the transition out of my job, and then when I made the transition away from Hawaii to the Philippines, I spent, there was a lot going on. I had a giant spreadsheet of all the different things we had to get done before this date, and the packing and the this and the that. But I really built into all of it connecting with people that I wanted to make sure I said goodbye to. So I think that would be one thing, is like put your emotional and your inner life as a priority on your transition, right? Like, make sure you take care of yourself, and you take care of saying goodbye to people or connecting with people so that you can stay connected when you get to your new place. Like, I spent a lot of time making sure that I come from a big family. I've got a lot of sisters, and like making sure all my sisters had the right app on their phone so we could continue to text, because I couldn't text using just regular phone text anymore because it would be expensive. So just making sure you've got some of those logistics things that will keep you connected to people that you want to stay connected to. So that would probably be my best piece of advice, is like, you got to get the work done of the transition, the logistics, but make sure that somewhere on that master plan is you and your own kind of mental and emotional health, and what you have to do to take care of yourself through that transition. Yeah.
As I was hearing you guys talk, I'm just going to share something random but related. So, going back to about the whole like stages of the transition, the things that you are experiencing as you are, planning your move, or once you get there, like that whole thing. I will say that's probably one of the reasons why I haven't moved anywhere, because I went in my mind mentally, went through all the different stages. Like, Shelly, you're going to be excited once you get there. But then, you know what? Living here is kind of like living, like life is life. You're going to have to keep on living it. However that's going to be, right? You're still going to have to go to work. You're still going to have to find a place to live. Like, maybe the difference is you got to make new friends, or, like that kind of thing. And because I would say people who probably are aware that I've had those thoughts, or like went through the thought process, probably knew me back in high school or something like that, planning to go to college, like, where should I be? Oh yeah, I like this city. And then I'm like, wait, hold on. And kind of like played that out in my mind. Or, even like a little after college, as I was like trying to consider, like, where do I want to work, right? Is it going to be here in Hawaii? Is it going to be somewhere else? Like, where are my friends moving to right now? Might I want to be there? Wait, I'm just going to know those two people there. Do I just want to hang out with them the whole time? And like, yeah, it's a cool city, but and it's kind of funny, because like on the flip side, I would say like going through those stages mentally, like not actually going through the stages with being somewhere else, I would say that in some ways made me decide that, like, okay, traveling and visiting maybe is the more like suitable thing for me personally.
It's funny you say that, because there are many differences between Carol's move and my move, right? She went to a different country. I stayed in the same country, but, you know, a ways away from Hawaii. But I was moving back to a place I had already lived. So essentially, I had built-in friends, right? I had a built-in understanding of what day-to-day life was like. But you're absolutely right. Like, I don't know, Carol, what do you think? Is that a good practice to think about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think what you did, Shelley, is really wise. I mean, like it's playing it out. And I think I had some other compelling factors, you know, like this opportunity with my husband, with his family's property and stuff like that. That was one of those things that's like, nobody's going to do it unless he does. And it potentially could be a great benefit for our family, you know, if it works out. And so there were other kind of compelling reasons that made me go, okay, I can kind of in my mind not worry too much about some of those things because I know I'll figure it out when I get there, kind of thing. There's some of that. But I think if I didn't have the compelling reason that we had, you know, with the property and with honestly, for me, just kind of like wanting to find a time space for myself, like I would have been more, I've probably been more investigative in that respect. And maybe it would have been a different decision, you know, it may well have been. But I do think one of the things that I did do too was to really, I mean, the age we live in is so fantastic. I mean, there's so many people out there that, like, whether it's Instagram or YouTube, you know, they tell you what their experiences are, right? Like, here's my experience. And I found tons of like expat Americans living in the Philippines, you know, what does it look like? And I even found like a woman who, you know, she's a little bit young. She was a little bit younger than me. She had kids. I mean, she wasn't exactly like not married to a Filipino, but like she had some similarities. So like finding people that like are kind of like your story, you know, and seeing how did they do it. And that was one of the things that I did too, to kind of give myself, you know, to kind of like pressure test it a little bit. Like, could I do this? Is this possible? And I think I was also in a place where I really wanted a big change, if that makes sense. Like it was less about, is it going to fit in all the ways that my current life fits? And in some ways it was more about, is it going to be the opposite in many ways of what my current life is? Like, I wanted a big change. And so I think it really does kind of depend on your why. Like, why are you doing this? What's the motivation for what you're doing?
Yeah. That's definitely a good point, because like for me, for example, the reason why I'm like, you know, I think traveling and like vacationing there is more suitable for like, you know, what I'm looking for is because literally everywhere I want to live is either just as or more expensive than Hawaii. So that's not really helping me. Like I'd probably I'd have to I would have to find a better job or, you know, something, or like live in a smaller place, or, you know, I'd have to be cutting away something. So in that case, I'm like, yes, Airbnb, you know, can be cheap sometimes. That's, you know, vacation. Yeah, good idea.
Well, and the other thing that came up for me too is it kind of, in so many ways, like your mindset really matters, right? Like if you asked me right now, okay, Carol, tell me all the bad things about the transition and the move and your life. Sure, I could sit here and I could list, you know, I could give you a laundry list of things that like don't compare, right, to Hawaii or don't compare to the States or whatever. But it's not where I choose to focus.
Sure.
And that's part of it too, is I think just having a mindset around like, okay, if you're committed to this, what are you going to focus on to get yourself through those times when things aren't as good as they were where you came from, or they're not, you're missing things, you're in that place of grieving, right? Like, what are the bigger things? And I think that's something my husband and I have gone back to a lot when, you know, if there's been times like the pandemic's really hard, it's been really hard here, a lot more strict quarantine and things like that. And especially with a kid, it's been tough. And just being able to like have a conversation with my husband around, yes, this is hard, but this is why we're doing this. This is this is the places of kind of growth and connection we wanted to have that we were missing out on before, and now we have those. And so I think that's the other thing, is just trying to figure out how to orient yourself and what to orient yourself to through the transition and beyond, right?
Yeah. I think that's a great point.
So I think you touched on a couple of good ways to navigate your mental health when it comes to from the time you land to the time you get acclimated. Is there any other advice you might give in terms of what to consider or what to do once you are now in the thick of it, right? You're now living where you were planning on living.
Well, one thing, I think we talked about this before, but like, it's one thing to remember. I mean, it depends on, how big of a move it is. Like moving from one country to another, like it gives more of an opportunity for this, but I think it's true of any place you go. If it's, if you're moving just from one neighbor to the other, it may not be as big of a transition, but bigger transitions is just recognizing and it kind of allowing yourself to recognize that every place has its own systems, right? Like you can come in, like I came here and I'll use driving as an example. Like it's crazy here. Like it feels crazy. It feels chaotic. It feels like there's really no order on certain parts of the, driving experience. Like for example, there's an intersection not too far from where I live where it's a 4-way intersection and it has no stoplight and it's a major road. So it's like, it just seems like chaos. And but when I came here with, I'm a systems thinker, and I came here with this sort of understanding of the world that like every place has its own systems, right? And its own ways of doing things. And so that's one thing I just challenged myself to be like, okay, just know that even if I can't see it, there's a system here, there's a process here, and not to be judgmental of it, right? Not to be like, oh, this isn't like the way it is back home, so it must be bad, and really giving yourself an opportunity to be curious about what is the underlying system. And like, I still don't necessarily know exactly what the underlying system is with driving, but what I can see is there's basically, one rule or 2 rules: don't hit anything and don't get hit. And so like, you start to realize like, okay, there may not be exact rules all the time in play, but there's these underlying sort of like guidelines that everybody's trying to follow. And so I think that would be one piece, is like really amp up. Like if you think about yourself as like, like you have all these capacities as a human being, and like each capacity has a dial, right? Like, so I would say turn your curiosity way up, turn your judgment way down, and see what happens, right? Because then you can start to see things that if you go in and you're just like, well, this isn't like Hawaii, this is not good. Like you don't see the things that could be really cool about it. And I think the other thing is around values. Everybody has, every person has their own set of personal values, but I think societies have them, cultures have them. And, when you move from one country to another, as an example, like they have values too. They might be slightly different. And so just being aware of that, and aware of the fact that like, it's not bad or better, it's just different. And recognizing, starting to get curious about what those values are that are underlying some of the systems and the way people do things, and then seeing how those values work with you and your values. And oftentimes there's an intersection, where those things can work, but sometimes not. Sometimes there's some values that are like, it's okay to do that here, but it feels very wrong to me, and you have to kind of navigate that and figure out how to keep yourself in integrity in a place that maybe has different values than you do.
So interesting. Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned the driving piece, because I remember when I initially moved to Hawaii, I felt that was a little more chaotic. I don't know if it's the way my husband drives, because he's a little bit like, he says it's defensive driving, but I think it's a little more offensive. It feels more offensive. But there's much. In all the places that I've lived, there's always been, in the main roads, there's always been a left turn lane. And in Hawaii, especially in the main parts, Waikiki, downtown, there are very few lanes. And so it's not a situation of being courteous and waiting until there's an opening. You just got to get in where you fit in.
Yeah.
And I was just like, whoa, that was super close.
I know. It's I would like love to be a fly on the wall the first time you ever came here, and because it's like it seems like you can pretty much do anything as long as you don't hit anybody. You know,
it seems like Hawaii is a little more civilized. Hawaii's definitely more civilized than that.
Yeah.
It was just me going from never having to, learn one-way streets, which they do have in Honolulu quite a bit, and pretty much always having a left turn lane for the most part, and having wide open roads, right?
Yeah.
Hawaii, it's an island, so you work with what you got in terms of space.
Yeah, and that's like doubly true here. Like it's like Hawaii on steroids in that respect, right? Because there's so many more people and so many more vehicles, and it's interesting. But it's one of those things. Like I still don't like to drive here. Like I don't. If my husband can drive, I'm like, you drive. But it got me a little bit more relaxed though, because I'm like, okay, I know that there's the basic rules of the road, you stay in your lane, that kind of thing, and don't hit anybody. But it got me a little bit more relaxed because I was always like, okay, where's the sign? And I'm like, oh, there's no sign. There's no sign I need to follow here. Right. The sign is don't hit anybody. Pay attention. Be vigilant.
The other thing I was going to mention is, when you talk about systems, I moved to Las Vegas, and Las Vegas has a very different healthcare system than Hawaii or California, which is where I'm originally from. And it's more about you figuring out what your insurance carrier covers, not the doctor figuring it out, and not or the office folks, right? And having to move here and figure out who's going to be my carrier and who's the best carriers, and asking my network of people that I have, but who are already connected to their carrier. And so it was just navigating all of that was really tough, and has continued to be tough because I'm not sure that we chose the right healthcare plan. Yeah. We're noticing that now. And I totally forgot about this part of Las Vegas where it's like, you have to figure out what's covered by your provider. The doctor is just going to charge you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was like, no, I totally forgot about this.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I'm just like, oh, I feel so much empathy for you, Dempsey. Because like navigating, like it's one thing to like, from a very like I was talking about, you see the systems, have respect for the fact that there are systems, but it is another thing to be in the clutches of like a bureaucratic system. Yeah. And that is something that my husband has had to deal with more than me here in the Philippines, because he will go out and deal with, things like that. And it is challenging. It's really challenging.
Yeah. And I to Hawaii healthcare. Yeah. Hawaii healthcare is like the upper echelon of healthcare. Like the standards, the bare minimum standards are higher than what the ACA requires, Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think, but you did mention something I think is really important, is your network. Like, and I would just take that word and replace it with support. Like thinking about the support you're going to need for various aspects of your transition, whether it's health insurance, finding housing, all the different things, or just your own, like staying connected with people that matter to you, and that can support you as I had days where I was just like, what did I do? How did I possibly make this decision? And being able to have people you can talk to, I think that's a really, really important aspect. I teach a workshop on the importance of support and creating your own life support system. And one of the things I talk about is, anytime you're doing something new, challenging, or complicated, you need to up your support game. Like you need to actually find ways to either have more of the support that you already have, or bring additional and new support into your life. And when you're making a transition, like a big transition, new, complicated, and challenging, like those are all in play right there. So you've got to be thinking, I think, pretty critically about what support needs to look like in order for you to feel like you got this. Because if you're feeling like you're in free fall at any point, that's a scary place to feel. Like it's a scary place to be. So you've got to, I think, just really think very, critically about your support structure for yourself and what you need to build either before you leave or when you get there, how you're going to build it when you get there.
That sounds like a great class.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's something I learned that like I actually taught it after I did this transition to the Philippines, because it was one of the things that I had learned matters so much, and so when I left Hawaii, I made sure, like, I do this particular food program that I follow, and I had a mastermind group that I met with weekly, and I was like, I need to have another mastermind group. So 2 of them during this transition period. So for about a year, I had 2 groups. So I had regular weekly meetings with each one of those groups. And so it was just a way for me to stay connected and not get myself into a place of isolation, which you can do when you move to a new place and you don't have friends and you haven't connected with people yet. So just making sure you've got ways to either keep connections alive or ways and opportunities to grow new connections in the place that you're living.
We've been super lucky to have a good support network built in, and my husband is really good in terms of tapping into that. I'm terrible at it, but I'm trying to get better at it, because I realized through this pandemic that I actually do enjoy connecting with people, which I just didn't really believe before. Mm-hmm. But it's very important for me. But what I realized too was it's so important for my son. And we didn't get to have that conversation with him. He was too young. And he would have been like, sure, yeah. Like we asked him, do you want to move to Las Vegas? He was like, yeah, Las Vegas. But when we got here, he said he cried after a while and said, I want to go back to Hawaii. I want to go back with my grandma and grandpa. Aww. And he missed his family. And so at that point, we realized, we had already planned on integrating him into some other things out here, because he's not going to have the beach 10 minutes away, which he's so used to going to every day. Well, mm-hmm. Most days, right? He's not going to have his grandma and grandpa come over whenever they want, and his cousin and, his aunties and uncles and all the people that he's connected with. I don't think we really took as much of that into consideration until he started bringing these things up. And I also think it was because we were in a smaller place in Hawaii. So we were always together, where we got a little bit more space here. And so I'm in my office during the workday, and they're not necessarily like right next to me as much anymore. So I think that had something to do with it too. But what we've started to do now that things are getting a little bit better out here, we've started to take him to the library, where there's really amazing free resources for him to take books home. And there's like a 15-minute reading time where they allow limited number of kids, and it's all safe. They wear masks and things. And my husband just brought up enrolling him in swim lessons. So I feel like if you're gonna take this opportunity to move to a new place and some of the family considerations is how you're gonna integrate your children into the new place as well, because they might be going through the same thing.
Yeah, I think that is a huge point to make there. I'm glad you brought it up, because one thing to think about too, like, and it came up with me, is there's that saying, like, how does it go? If mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. And I don't know about you, Tempsy, but like when my kid isn't happy, it hurts me, right? Like it's hard. And so like thinking about that, and even to some degrees with my husband, like I've really pushed him to prioritize connection when, like go reach out, like before pandemic, like go have those dinners and lunches with your college friends, because you haven't seen them in forever, and like get those things, get those networks built back up and make those connections. And with our kids, like, we have to engineer that, right? Like, we have to put them in places where it's possible to have that connection and to have those things happen. But it's totally worth it. Like, it's an important piece of connecting them into and getting them solid and secure in the new place that they're going to live, for sure.
Yeah. So such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. And
yeah, thank you guys for having me back. I appreciate it. It was kind of fun to kind of walk through it and see, like, what did I do? How did this happen?
Yeah. And a lot of this, you know, in our previous conversations about this topic and deciding to connect on this was about how this can also play into career moves. And so that's going to be part 2 of this 2-part series with Miss Carol Surban. And we are going to get a little bit deeper into all of these considerations and, you know, your mental preparation and what happens once you're actually living in that situation when you switch careers or decide to start your own business.
Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks for coming on, Carol.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, you guys. I appreciate it.
Of course.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Outright Effect. You can find us at theoutrighteffect.com. Follow us on our social media accounts on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, all at The Outright Effect. You can also reach out to us by emailing us at theoutrighteffect@gmail.com. See you guys next time. Bye. Bye.